life. So on Friday, the government flew Aussie troops from Townsville down to Melbourne to help police the lockdown that's taking place in Melbourne. And and some people, when they're stopped and asked like who they are and where they're going, some people are actually refusing to give their ID. They feel like it's a protest against the freedoms that have been taken away. And and in a general sense, uh, every time people are asked that question, who are you and where you're going, I was thinking about that. I'm thinking, it's a brilliant question. It's a question about identity and purpose. It's a brilliant question. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, who are you watching right now? Who are you? And where are you going? What's happening in your life? And in thinking about that question, it took me back to a night in the life of Jesus when he was betrayed. And earlier in that night, something remarkable happening. Something happened that was unexpected. He stripped down and he washed the dirty, dusty, smelly feet of his leadership team. On our farm, especially in the summer, I love to get out in bare feet. And in the dust and the dirt and the sweat of summer, I walk back inside at the end of a day and I love to do nothing more than get into an empty bath and just wash my feet. And when I can sit down then at tea time with clean feet, it just feels so good. I probably do it because, well, Coral's never offered to wash my feet. In fact, she's probably the one that says to me, go to the bathroom before I come inside. But she's never offered to wash my feet. But can you imagine the conversation that was happening that night when Jesus, the leader of the team, is getting down and washing the boys' feet? They're asking him why. And in this conversation, he actually tells them that you won't actually understand this tonight. But I want you to learn from this. In fact, he said it's an example that he was setting to them. And over the years, I've heard of churches that have done this foot washing ceremony. I think they do it with clean feet, right? But but I think when you do that, you actually miss the power of the moment. You actually miss what Jesus was trying to convey. In fact, John, when he accounts the story, when he writes the story in years later, he now has an insight that he never had that night. And he sets up this moment with an explanation, a commentary. And this is what he writes in John chapter 13, verse 3. John says this: Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all authority, all power over everything, and that he had, and here it is, come from God and would return to God. So he got down and he washed their feet. Knowing who he was and where he was going, Jesus was free to strip down and wash his disciples' feet. But more than that, the next day he was willing to be stripped naked by men and nailed his feet and his hands to a cross and not fight back and not protest over his innocence and not fight for his life in a sense, because Jesus, his identity was not in what he did or what he would go through. His identity, excuse me, just COVID, don't worry about it. So his identity was in God's Son, and he knew his purpose went beyond the cross. Now, the last few weeks, we've been looking at the subject of boulders and backpacks. Boulders are the heavy things that come crushing into our life, like a fire destroying things, a relational breakdown. They're the weights that are too much to carry. Like for Glenda this morning, her cat being in the hospital there trying to save its life, and they're the overwhelming things. And in the Bible, Paul tells us that is something we are to help each other carry. But there's an area of our life, and Paul describes it as a backpack. It's just what you carry for one day. It's always light, and that's for us to carry. And last week we looked at what's in our backpack, and one of the things that's in our backpack is our energy, how we manage with that. And if you haven't seen that, I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at last week's because I think it's helpful. But this week, we're going to look at what's in our backpack, another thing. And one of those things is our ID, our identity. It's who we are and where we're going. It's the answer to that question. And we're the only one that can answer that. And that is in our backpack. And when you think about it, it can seem complicated because in life, identity can come from many directions. Talents and gifts. It can be negative things that have happened to you as a child growing up. It can be family backgrounds and culture has an impact. But it's not complicated. It's actually really simple. We have two choices. Our identity is either found in being sons and daughters of a living God, or it's in something else. And the world we live in, there's a attack on identity. There's identity theft. There's scams. And it's going on all the time. And a number of years ago, Coral's ID was stolen. Her phone ID was taken. They actually convinced Optus that they were Coral, and they got the SIM card changed. And then $10,000 in a credit card in Coral's bank account was withdrawn. We didn't have the money, but it was shifted from that account, from a credit card into another account, and then taken and stolen. It took, I think, 6 or 8 weeks to get that $10,000 for the bank to sort that out, and Coral didn't lose it all, but someone stole her identity. And when it was stolen, she had no power to do anything with her own money, with her own resources. And just before Jesus launched his public ministry, he came under attack from Satan. And Satan attacked him in an area that he knew if he could get this happening, he could take Jesus out, because Satan had been unsuccessful at killing Jesus as a baby. So he's trying to wipe Jesus' ministry out before it even gets going. And his attack begins with this question to Jesus. He says to him, if you are, if you are the Son of God, make these stones turn into bread. Jesus was hungry. He'd been fasting for days, and it's not a bad thing to turn stones into bread. It'd be a good party trick, wouldn't it? Right? And it wasn't a bad thing, but if Satan could get Jesus to just doubt if he is the Son of God and do something good from doubt, he had a hold over Jesus. It didn't work. But if he can have a crack at Jesus, he certainly has a go at us. And he has a go at us consistently in this area of identity because he knows it works. Now, back in the garden, when Satan wanted to attack Adam and Eve, he began by sowing doubt into their minds as to the goodness, the character of God. He began, did God really say? And he twisted a half-truth. He lied about what God said, and he put a doubt into Adam and Eve's minds that God was keeping good stuff back from them. And what happened was they exchanged their identity as sons and daughters of the God of all creation for being masters of their own identity. I, for a long time, have tried to help people understand what sin is by saying what sin isn't. And it isn't telling a lie. And it isn't stealing. It isn't hating. It isn't murder. Ultimately, I found the definition of sin that worked for me was saying, God, I don't need you. And as a result of that, we live self-focused, and we sure, if it's mutually beneficial, we'll be nice to someone else. We'll love someone else. But we live self-focused, and as a result of that, these other things are the fruit of that. We do lie. We do take what we want for ourselves. And anyway, I found, I think, a better sort of explanation of sin. And this I found, and I heard it recently from a guy called Timothy Keller, and he's a theologian, a preacher in America. And his definition of sin is this: building your identity on anything but God. A few years ago, I watched a documentary based also in America, and there was these so-called Christians, and they were attacking the LGBTQ community in America, and they were standing on street corners, and they had these signs, and it says, "Gays go to hell." And as I watched this documentary, it became really obvious that these Christians, their identity was not in being sort of accepted through grace, sons and daughters of God. Their identity was in their keeping of what they saw was a moral law, and they were comparing themselves to others, and this arrogance and this pride crept in, like the Pharisees in Jesus' time, and they became so critical of anyone that wasn't living up to the standard that they thought they were living up to. And if the definition of sin, a really good definition, is building your identity on anything but God, then those Christians and the people they are attacking have a shared problem, because all of them have built their identity on anything but sons and daughters of a living God. If you have trouble trusting God, it's because there's an area in your life that you doubt his character, his goodness. And occasionally someone will say to me, if God is such a loving God, well, why does he send people to hell? It's a question based on doubting God's character, and it's a question that has a wrong assumption about hell at the end of it. Because God doesn't send anyone to hell. All those who end up in hell, they choose it. It's a consequence of a freely chosen identity based on anything else but God. And it begins in this life and it transfers into eternity. Without self-choice, it wouldn't be hell, it would be punishment. Hell has nothing to do with punishment. It has everything to do with our identity, a separation that we choose. Have you ever lived with regret? A choice you've made that you wish you could change it, but you can't go back, and you're stuck with it, and you even hate yourself? Hell is self-hatred. It's self-torment. Either when we breathe our last breath, we cease to exist, or the real you, your spirit, your personality, your soul, the real you, steps into another reality and gets a promised new body. My dad, the last years of his life, lived with a paralysed body from a stroke, and one of the things that he was looking forward to in eternity was a new body. Either that is true, what the Bible says, what the Bible teaches, or we cease to exist, and whatever we do in this life doesn't matter. But if the Bible's true, then what we do here matters now, but it also matters for eternity. And Jesus spoke more about hell than any other Bible commentary, any other Bible writer. In fact, he spoke more about hell than heaven. But he didn't do it just to scare us. He didn't do it as a threat of punishment if we do something wrong, because hell has nothing to do with punishment. And I'm going to talk more about that next week, but I'm just going to right now get Rachel to read for us something that Jesus told, a story Jesus told. It's in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. Thanks, Rachel.
Very good. Okay, the rich man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He said to them, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead.
Thanks, Rachel. It's interesting, that is the only parable, the only story that Jesus ever told where 2 of the characters are named. One character isn't. And not naming one of the characters, the rich man, is very deliberate. When you look into the story, in the background, the rich man would have been a religious person. Culturally, it was expected that a rich man would follow all the Jewish laws, all the ceremonies. He would keep the law of Moses. And yet, in death, this rich man has no identity, because his identity was based in his wealth, his position, his status in life, but in death, in hell, he has no name. Lazarus has his identity, has his name, and sin, if it's built upon, if sin is actually building upon anything but an identity in God, it also means that there are times when we turn good things into ultimate things. We turn things that seem noble and we take them to an extreme, and they aren't. The poor man, Lazarus, he didn't end up in heaven because he'd had a tough life, because he was poor, any more than the rich man ended up in hell because he was rich. Did you notice in the story that Rachel was reading out, did you notice that the rich man never asks to be got out of hell? He just wants Lazarus to come and to ease his suffering. When I first met my friend Paul, he'd been addicted to heroin for a long time. I tried really hard to help set him free from the addiction, but Paul, I don't think, really wanted to be free. Like the rich man in hell, he just wanted his pain to be eased when it got too bad. And he would come out to the farm and spend time with me, and he'd feel good, and he'd go away. Like one Christmas, he spent Christmas dinner with us as part of our family. And when Paul died, I think it took 2 years of my life to recover from the loss that I felt with his death. And in the process, in the grieving for me, I wrote a little poem, and part of it in the poem says, Why, Paul, why? You didn't have to die. Jesus was there, but you believed a lie. And part of Paul's identity was formed through the lyrics of a Chris de Borg's song, Don't Pay the Ferryman. And in this song, there's an unknown voice, and it keeps saying, whatever you do, don't pay the ferryman. Don't even pay a price. he gets you to the other side. And Paul would say to me, he's not going to make a decision about heaven and hell, of God and Satan, until he gets to the other side. And then he'll make up his mind what he wants to do. In the end, there will only be two kinds of people. Those who have looked to a faithful God and found adoption and sons and daughters, who have said to God, your will be done in my life. And there'll be those that have doubted the goodness of God, who as orphans have created their own identity, who in the end, God will say to them, your will be done in your life. The first time that I stepped onto the Bairnsdale High School secondary campus grounds as a youth worker, I was so intimidated by the eyes of all the kids looking at you. And yet that first lunchtime when I left, I was just like walking on cloud nine. I had discovered what God had put me on earth for. It was exhilarating knowing that in my identity I had found purpose. The identity that I'd found in God had taken me to this adventure, and I've spent most of my life working with youth. And that has been a setup that I walked into when I found who I am in Jesus. But there was a day when one of our youth kids came to me and she said to me, Lex, this teacher has done this more than once, but he sort of playfully slapped me on the backside. And she said, I just feel really yucky. It just makes me feel yucky. And she said, I'm going to the principal to talk to him about it. And so she did. But when she arrived at the principal's office to bring this thing out into the open, the teacher was there plus another teacher, and she was left feeling shamed and guilted and worse than before she went and spoke up. And she came back to me and she said, they just made me feel so bad because the teacher that did this just said, well, I was lying, that I was making it up, that it was an accident, that there was nothing in it, and she was making this all up. But she knew she wasn't. And it really got me. And after she left, I did something that I'd never done before. Something rose up inside of me. No one was around, but an authority just rose up inside of me because this was wrong. It was injustice. It was wrong. It was sexual harassment. And this teacher had a very high profile in the Bairnsdale community, with especially with youth. He was one of those try-hard youths. He was always sort of trying to be involved in the decisions that young people made in the community, and he wanted to be on every committee that youth were on. And by myself this day, I just prayed against his influence in the youth culture of Bairnsdale back then. And I had this authority that just rose up in me. I've never known it before. And as I prayed, it was like done. And what I noticed was that over the months that came, he didn't resign, he didn't leave his position as a teacher there, but his influence in that school just faded away. And what happened that day is, in my identity as a son of a living God, I found an authority that I'd never known before. And I've carried that authority for all the years since then. I carry it in here now. You don't see it, but it gives a quiet confidence that where we're going as a church, as a people, as we step into the unknown, that we're stepping into God's setups, that He is before us and He's given us as sons and daughters an authority to function in. When you find your identity in Him, you'll find the adventure. You'll find who you really are. You'll find revelations of levels that keep growing and developing. And we're going to finish with two songs. I'd encourage you to really hang in there and listen and allow God to show you new things. One of the songs is a song that Rachel has written herself. It's fantastic to have original songs as part of Red Gum. But I just encourage you to listen and allow God's Spirit to touch you. And we'll see you next week. So, Rachel.